Well, welcome everyone. We'll get started here. Thanks for joining. I am recording this session just so everyone is aware, and I just wanted to welcome you. Thanks for joining. This is hosted by University College. We're the College of Continuing and Professional Studies here at the University of Denver, and this evening's panel discussion relates to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the global implications we can anticipate related to this through the lenses of supply chain, the media, security, specifically cybersecurity, and more. I wanted to mention that we do have representation from several of our graduate programs here this evening, and so supply chain management, the global community engagement program, and the information and communications technology program. So we offer graduate certificates and master's degrees in these programs, along with non-credit professional development opportunities, primarily through our Center for Professional Development. And our career-focused education from a top 100 university is designed for adult learners and delivered entirely online or evenings on campus. So if you're interested in learning more, we do have some enrollment managers with us this evening that you can speak to. Send us a message if you want to send me a private message in the chat with your contact information. We can follow up with you, or go ahead and visit our website at universitycollege.du.edu. We're currently accepting applications for our summer term, and we're accepting those through April 29th if you're interested. So a few just logistical items for the session tonight. If you could please use the chat function for any questions that come up, and if related to the ongoing conversation, we'll interject with those questions and bring them up, or we'll save some for the end perhaps. And then if you don't mind staying on mute for the duration of the panel discussion, just to ensure there's no kind of feedback or extraneous sounds coming through. But I'll turn things over now to our moderator for the evening, Dr. Ariana Nowakowski. She's the academic director for our Global Community Engagement Program.
Great, thanks so much, Victoria. Welcome everyone and good evening. It's great to see such a turnout here tonight on a Tuesday evening. Although in some ways it's unfortunate that we have to have this webinar because it's just been such an incredible turn of events over the past couple of weeks. But I'm glad that we're able to come together and discuss some really important topics. We have a fantastic panel lined up for you tonight. And I'd like to give everyone a moment to introduce themselves. Maybe we can go somewhat, I don't know, in the order in which you're appearing on my screen. So I will go ahead and ask Jack, if you want to go ahead and start and introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jack Buffington. I'm the program director for supply chain management at the University of Denver. And a fun fact about me is I took Russian for 6 years in middle school and high school. So I understand it from more than from a supply chain perspective.
Thank you, Jack. Wonderful. Richard, would you like to go ahead and say a few words?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Richard Stanings. I teach cybersecurity and health informatics as part of University College. Fun fact, I'm actually just outside of Cheltenham right now. So it's Wednesday morning here right now, in the middle of the night, but I'm here for meetings tomorrow around this very subject. So
wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us. And Eric. Oops, I think you're muted there, Eric.
Sorry about that. I am Dr. Eric Fetter. I am instructor at University College in the Global Studies program. I'm also a professor of political science at Colorado State University. My focus is on international security and political theory. I also, in my research, do work on media and communications technology as a form of power in interstate relations. And hopefully I can provide some insight on that if it comes up. I don't have a fun fact prepared. I guess if we're doing locations, I'm in Fort Collins. I guess that's fun in a way.
Great, thank you so much. And I didn't even realize it until I started the webinar, but I do have a handy dandy Russian dictionary right here behind me, Jack. So if we ever have a question that comes up and I need to look something up on the fly, I'm there, can do it. Great.
Sure.
Well, I think we have a very strong panel. I am very sorry to report that Karen Gurwitz, who is the president and CEO of the World Trade Center, came down with a little cold bug and completely lost her voice. So she had to decline our invitation to be with us here tonight and won't be able to join us, but we have a very competent panel who I know will be able to answer a lot of the questions that we would all like to discuss this evening. So without further ado, I will just jump right in and start with a question for Richard, or really anybody, I think, something that's been in the news really just recently. In fact, President Biden, I know, warned or maybe recommended that American organizations and companies have some sort of a plan for dealing with cyber attacks. And so, one of the things that is really, I think, on our minds right now is, how might organizations prepare? How real of a threat is this? And what's actually being done to try to grapple with the potential for Russian cyber threats against American organizations or companies? Richard, I think you're muted.
Yeah, the joys of technology. Apologies for that. So as I was saying, I think it's not just an American problem, American threat against American businesses and institutions. It's a global Western threat, right? All of those Western societies that are supporting Ukraine against the Russian invasion, that are under threat from increased cyber activity from the Russian Federation. And we've already seen indications of a massive uptick in the level of cyber activity from the organized crime syndicates that we're all fondly aware of, or less fondly perhaps, that have been wreaking havoc against a lot of Western institutions for many, many years, many decades in cases, with the ransomware attacks, and they are now focusing on upticking that traffic against the West in order to support Mother Russia. At the same time, we're also seeing an uptick in political hacktivists, particularly the anonymous group, which has kind of spearheaded their attacks against Russian websites. The Kremlin website has been pretty much down since the beginning of the conflict. A number of other websites and institutions have been down for a long time, and they are targeting the critical infrastructure of Russia. That potentially could result in Russian state actors, the GRU, part of their military cyber capabilities, to respond against the US and the West, which would then involve the US government institutions responding to those cyber attacks against critical infrastructure. So we are at the cusp of a fairly massive escalation here, and I think that's why the president sent out the message that he did today, and other leaders of Western societies have been sending out similar messages to their government departments, to their institutions, commercial and public institutions, to basically be on the watch out for increased level of cyber activity, of nefarious cyber activity that could impede the operation of their businesses. And that's everything from the critical infrastructure that powers society in Western countries, electricity being perhaps one, healthcare perhaps being another. Obviously, there are 16 critical infrastructure industries that were outlined in PDP 21, I believe it was, several years ago, that we focus on in the US, and all of them are critical to the survival of our society in a functioning state. So I believe that most societies have afforded extra levels of protection and awareness around those institutions. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, as the president said, the government is not going to protect everything here, but the government is going to try and help. So the onus is really one of partnership, and ultimately institutions themselves need to be able to protect themselves. They need to make sure they're patched. They need to make sure they're following a decent cybersecurity framework. They need to make sure that they have security operations capabilities to monitor what's happening to their networks 24/7. And they need reserves on backup, whether it's retainer-based reserves for security incident response capabilities, forensic investigation capabilities, or simple restoration capabilities of those services for to minimize the impact.
So I'd like to come back to this question a little bit later. It would take us off topic a bit if I were to raise it right now. I'm wondering, I'll just put it out there, I'm wondering in the event that this escalates rather quickly, if these types of cyber attacks on infrastructure, for example, would be considered an act of war, right? That's something that I think is on everybody's mind, is given kind of new technologies and new ways of waging war, would this be considered an act of aggression that would potentially elevate this conflict and bring the United States and NATO partners into it more directly? And I don't know, we can address it now or later, but I think that's something that's really on everyone's minds as well, is, is this something that could, at what level, at what tipping point, would this elevate to something that brings others into it in ways that we haven't been involved?
I would say we've been in a state of cyber war with Russia and China for quite a considerable time already. The question is, and where I think you're trying to go with this, is where is the crossover between a cyber war activity and a more kinetic response to a cyber attack, right? And we've seen that in the past. Perhaps Israel's a good example of that. Several years ago, Israel was facing an attack by Hamas against the critical infrastructure of the Israeli state, and they took preemptive action against HamasHQ.com and basically, or Hamas EXE, I think it was, and basically preemptively bombed the building and flattened the building that Hamas hackers were working out of. We've also seen other kinetic responses to cyber threats. The United States has basically taken out perpetrators of cybercrime with Hellfire missiles launched from drones over Rafah in the past, right? And we're not the only ones to do that. Other countries have done similar kinetic responses to cyber threats that were considered a clear and present danger to their institutions, to their countries.
Eric or Jack, anything to add to any of that, or has Richard covered everything?
Well, first off, I gotta say I'm impressed with how many books you have behind you. I have like 6, and you have about 6 million. Well, one thing I wanted to add to that is, relative to cyber attacks and how this thing could escalate. And actually, maybe I should say, I was going to talk a little bit about war logistics. Is that the right time to talk about this, or should I wait
Absolutely,
on that?
Sure.
Okay, I didn't want to just intentionally change the topic, but one thing that I think is not getting enough attention is, it's not a hot war that's being fought right now, but it is a supply war that's being fought between Russia and Ukraine. And I think a lot of the success that the Ukrainians are having has a lot to do with the supply line that's coming in through Poland. And the one thing that scares the out of me is that supply chain being disrupted. I think the last couple of days, there's been a conversation about Belarus joining the war. And the problem with that, of course, is if Belarus joins the war, they're obviously going to be brought in order to halt the supply line that's coming in from Poland. And all the supplies right now that are coming into Ukraine from all over the world. I don't know if you just saw this, but Australia is sending coal in through Poland that's getting to Ukraine because they don't have any energy, because 50% of their energy supply is nuclear power that's been taken offline. So that really scares me, as well as like what some of Richard was talking about regarding cyber attacks and how that could potentially lead to a hot war, is potentially Belarus cutting off the supply line to Poland and attacking a NATO country. And then all of a sudden, instead of having a war between Russia and Ukraine, you have a war that's between NATO and Russia and its allies. So I think it kind of ties to that. And that's something that I think that's not getting enough attention that really scares me.
Absolutely. And Eric, maybe you could speak generally, since we're kind of drifting in this direction, to how this issue has changed in some ways the way European states see issues of security in general. Supply chain and cybersecurity issues are certainly front and center, but is this really shifting in some ways the overall security approaches and policies of European states?
Yes, the short answer is yes, very much so. Because of the multifaceted nature of the conflict, which the other two panelists have detailed. You have countries like Germany, which had been very restrained in the amount of money it's spent on military capabilities of all kinds, both conventional weapons and sort of these specialized forms of operation. They are now increasing the budgets of their, the allocation of their budgets towards defense, towards military capability. They are engaging more robustly with other states in Europe and other institutions in Europe like NATO in a way that they were very much reluctant to before. I think this conflict has been, if I can use this term, beneficial from the NATO perspective, in that suddenly they have a problem to actually focus on now. There was a real risk that that institutions like NATO were becoming increasingly obsolete because the NATO didn't really have a mission beyond sort of this peripheral support for the war on terror. And now the sort of original existential problem of NATO, which was the Soviet Union, has reemerged in the form of this very aggressive Russian threat. And so all of these countries that were ambivalent about NATO before, or ambivalent about devoting more of their resources to security issues, are now increasing more resources that direction. You also have states in Europe that were not members of NATO now wanting to join NATO. You have countries like Sweden, you have countries like Finland, which were very abrupt and very clear in their willingness to remain neutral and their desire to remain neutral vis-a-vis European security, not wanting to antagonize one side or the other. They, especially like the Finns, have seen that we are directly in the line of fire now. If we don't have allies that can come to our assistance, obviously with Finland, there's a rich history of them being able to take care of Russia in armed conflict and the various conflicts that they fought in the past, but they would much prefer to have a large network of support coming from NATO and NATO countries in the United States and all that comes with it. And so we've seen, again, NATO sort of reemerge as a very important security institution. We've also seen the EU sort of come back to life from the recent Brexit debacle. And you have a lot of states, again, that were not really interested in joining the European Union or were even discouraged from joining the European Union, now very much interested in joining the European Union, and not just obviously Ukraine, but countries like Moldova, countries like Georgia, which are directly in the sphere of influence of Russia, wanting very much to align themselves and throw their hat in with the European political institutions because they believe they're going to be more secure and more prosperous in that sphere than in the sphere of Russian influence. And even though geographically that works against them, they're willing to sort of try to overcome the limits of geography and engage and become more deeply embedded in traditional European institutions. So this is quite, I mean, the title of this panel is, game changer. Here's where one of the games changes. The emergence of security is a fundamental and primary issue for European states and and the foreign policy of European states.
And it sounds like potentially a game changer for the institutions themselves as well, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you. We have a couple of questions in the chat, and before we move too far down the road here, I want to make sure we address any that are still kind of timely. Let's see. So Aaron, going back to the cyber security question, Aaron is wondering if a large multi-regional cyber high vector assault or attack across the US, in that situation, are local regional institutions, universities, colleges preparing? And maybe I'm not understanding the question. Aaron, do you want to just go ahead and ask your question?
Sure. No, sorry about that.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah. So what I was wondering, can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. What I was wondering is, colleges and universities are uniquely positioned because you have students. So, and you have, technical professionals, obviously people teaching, adjuncts, et cetera. And I was wondering if schools and universities are working locally to try to generate, sort of pre-positioned capacity, so that, when there's these types of, very almost like hurricane-like attacks, right? Where the federal government and state government, and we all know through COVID and just in general, it's just not built, right? I mean, we think there's a magic wand and it doesn't exist. These are small little sort of emergency response organizations at the federal level, and even at the state level, they're smaller. So unless there's this capacity to execute, very locally, when you think of your local hospitals or your local, kind of government, municipal, county level organizations who have very limited or no capacity, universities and colleges are really well positioned to sort of act as that 911 force, let's say, which I think in that first week or two is really important, because you have a lot of hands, a lot of legs, a lot of keyboards, a lot of people, and I think that is something I just don't see. I don't see that discussion. I don't see anybody at the national level just wouldn't in general drive that. So I'm just wondering if that's a conversation, because I know you guys are at a great school, great university, and you think big ideas, and you had big idea people for generations. So I'm just wondering if that's something that's ever entered in. Does that make sense? I mean, sorry for a long-winded question there.
So generally, what is the role of universities or colleges in kind of being?
Well, I mean, think about
right?
it this way. I mean, pretend it's not cyber. Pretend there was a horrific set of tornadoes, and you had a teaching medical hospital. What would those people do? Would they just stand around and say, well, no, I don't do that because it's the FEMA, and I'm just going to go home tonight and wait to teach my class tomorrow? Of course they wouldn't, right? They would jump into their, sort of oath of providing those type of, emergency response services. Is there something that you see, either your university that you're in and or the collective universities, just take your region you're in Denver, greater Denver, whatever, central Colorado area, forming some type of sort of pre-emergency response? Because ultimately you're going to do that after anyways, if something happens. So you might as well prep it ahead of time. So that's just something I'm just wondering if that's something that's ever entered into the conversation anywhere, or am I just the crazy person saying it for the first time? Sorry about that long-winded question.
Yeah, no worries. No, I'll chime in if that's all right with you, Ariane.
Please.
So, plainly the security leaders at all of the Colorado higher educational institutions all talk to one another. They share information around threats that they're seeing. And it's done, for the mutual protection of all of those institutions, in the same way that, hospitals share information across the Denver metropolitan area, for example, right? Then we have more formal structures like the ISACs, and they are organized on industry basis where, FSISAC, HISAC, you name it, for the various industries, and those are more formal information sharing. And then locally, we have, InfraGard, which is supported by the FBI, which allows the exchange of information between the public and the private sector, between the classified and the unclassified sector, right? And FBI is very forthcoming about clear and present threats that they see that may impact the institutions in the region. So that is going on, and I suspect there are probably a lot of other things going on, given the heightened threat that I'm not read into at this point, that are occurring.
Yeah, I would agree that it varies probably by program. I mean, some programs are more closely tied to, current events than others. And so certainly there's a lot of networking. University College, of course, employs professional practitioners as our faculty. And so they're very well networked with local organizations and professional industries. And so it's a lot of information sharing, I would say, and doing what we're doing tonight in some ways, trying to sort through, this mountain of information, some of it plausible and accurate and some of it not, and try to advance the conversation based on scholarly ideas. That's kind of what we do. I think your point, though, is well taken, that universities do a lot of theorizing and talking. And so what are you actually doing? And I would say that is kind of a program by program sort of thing. People working in medicine are obviously very tied into what's going on in that realm and so forth. So Great question. Thank you very much for posing that. We have a couple of others. Carly had one. She's asking what you see as being the impact to African countries if they have disruptions to the wheat that they import from Ukraine. And actually, Jack, maybe you could speak more broadly, because this was on my list of questions as well. You know, obviously supply chains are being disrupted in a variety of different parts of the world. So, you know, maybe starting with the African sort of countries and then branching out from there.
Yeah, this is a really difficult question. I mean, it's a difficult problem that's going on. So I'm not sure if everybody knows, but both Ukraine and Russia are massive providers for corn, wheat, barley, you know, staples like that. Throughout history, you know, Ukraine's been fought over due to its black soil, the steppes of, you know, it was called the steppes of Russia, really it's Ukraine. So it's always been a fertile farming region as well as in Russia. And Africa is highly dependent on, you know, corn, barley, wheat from this part of the world, specifically in Ukraine. I think, you know, I think it's like 40 or 50% of all wheat grain commodities come into Africa from Ukraine. So now we've completely disrupted that element of the food supply chain. And on top of that, in the Horn of Africa in particular, 46%, sorry, I got it wrong. See, I know people are going to Google to see if I got it right. 46%, it's a lot, right? So yeah, so it's particularly in the Horn of Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, areas that have been subject to major climate change issues and drought. You know, you're just further exacerbating the crisis that's happening in that part of the world. On top of, it's pretty much the only region of the world that was outside of the vaccine distribution. You know, African countries had the lowest vaccination rates due to a lack of supply. So, you know, you're facing droughts, facing, you know, a shortage of pretty much your lifeline when it comes to food on top of the challenges with COVID. So it's just a really difficult situation.
You're kind of leading into the next question I wanted to ask, which was that we've seen disruptions already in the supply chain and trade because of COVID, the pandemic. And now this conflict is really compounding the impact on shipping, rail, air freight, and so forth. So what predictions, if you were to get out that crystal ball, what predictions might you have for the global supply chain and just how the market might respond?
Yeah, if there hasn't been enough news already about what's going on in supply chain, I mean, here we go again, right? So I've been at the University of Denver for like 3 years, and for 2 years, nobody wanted to talk about supply chain. And now all of a sudden it's like supply chain this, supply chain that. And so we're starting to recover from the challenges with COVID, although there are parts of the world that are, you know, China particularly, that are going back into somewhat of a lockdown. But I think what this provides everybody with is a real understanding of how global our supply chains are. So I think everybody's aware of the challenges with energy, you know, with the pipeline that goes through Russia, you know, or through Ukraine via Russia. And when Germany got off nuclear power, they were highly dependent on these pipelines. So, you know, now Europe is in the grip of the problem with, you know, getting energy from a foe, right? But it's not just energy, right? We talked about the commodities, the corns, the grains, and things like that. But Russia is also one of the leading countries related to fertilizers. And so, you know, on top of the fact that it's not growing, you know, wheat and growing barley in Ukraine, but now you're, you know, restricting fertilizers to other parts of the world that grow crops as well. But then, you know, you even get into the automotive industry. Ukraine is responsible for, I think, at about, maybe Carly's going to tell me if I get this right, it's about 50% of the neon gas production in the world. And neon gas is particularly important in the production of semiconductors. And we all know the challenges associated with the production of semiconductors, given the fact there's a higher demand. Some of you may not have been able to buy a car because, you know, there's a shortage of semiconductors because everybody's buying computers. So you can see what's happening here, right? And as Ariana mentioned, you also have further disruptions in the supply lines because Geographically, one thing we should all know about that part of the world is it's a major supply route from the Baltic Sea to Black Sea, which is the reason why this part of the world's been fought over for so long, right? The Vikings came down and they basically settled Russia basically because they wanted to get to the Black Sea, right? So, I mean, I could keep going down the list of impacts to the supply chain, but it really just goes to show you how much how interdependent our global supply chain is.
It is interdependent, and we're starting to see almost calls for a return to more domestically produced products and that sort of thing as well. Do you think that that's kind of where things are headed, or again, getting up that crystal ball, right?
Well, I mean, I think that, just the calculations associated with this are not viable. I mean, whenever things like this happen, everybody's like, well, let's move to NearSourcing. And the supply lines just aren't set up to work like that. There's too much interdependencies because for the most part, the companies that are running these supply chains are multinational corporations. They're not necessarily public entities. So big changes in supply chains, well, whether it's fertilizer or coal or anything like that, are things that take time to work through planning and shipping, logistics, everything like that. So and then furthermore, as prices go up, because some of these areas, natural gas has gone up by 150%, coal's gone up by 70%. People are not willing to entertain higher prices. And when you talk about NearSourcing, that's what you're talking about, because in most of these cases, the highest cost is labor. The shipping costs are negligible. So it seems appealing. And there's some solutions down the road, but they're just not a place where we're going to get to it right now.
Mm-hmm. As we talk through all of the human rights violations that are taking place in Ukraine, for example, and elsewhere, I think it's important to, and I would come from this perspective as somebody who has studied Russia pretty extensively in the past, remembering that the sanctions that are being imposed, for example, are producing certain collateral effects, right? And when you're talking about supply chain and transport and all of these different things that are being impacted, in some ways they are happening as a result of these sanctions. And I'm wondering if we could just bring that into the conversation a little bit and think somewhat strategically about, that we're kind of making our own issues here in some ways when it comes to creating supply chain issues through sanctions.
I'll go ahead and field that one. I think what you're talking about is the attempt to find a trade-off between imposing punishment on Russia and the cost of imposing that punishment. Do we want to make certain sacrifices that manifest themselves in the supply chain and perhaps shortages in certain essential products, both consumer and otherwise, throughout the world, as a trade-off for imposing as much pressure, economic pressure as possible to affect a particular political end, which in this particular case is to coerce or persuade or somehow get Vladimir Putin to see the folly of his ways and to either seek a settlement that ends the dispute or ideally see him actually order his forces back to Russia and see some kind of restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty. So I think a lot of these discussions about supply chain highlight, yes, the complex interdependency that exists in the world. And this is a system that's been constructed over several decades. And the willingness to suffer and endure some of the vulnerabilities of that system that occur when an antisocial state begins to flout the standards of civilization in international politics.
You just articulated exactly the question that was in my mind, but that wasn't coming out. So I appreciate that. Exactly. That's exactly what I was trying to ask. Thank you. And I think that we need to also remember that this is having a tremendous impact on citizens within Russia as well, not all of whom support the regime, right? It's oftentimes very easy to say the Russians are being so terrible or the Germans or whatever, but this is really having a detrimental effect on the standard of living within Russia itself, which is something that we ought to keep in mind too. Speaking of, one of the things that we've seen happening over the past, well, honestly, about 12 years, but just the past couple of weeks is increasingly a crackdown on free press and restricted social media, and in fact, censorship in Russia. What do you all envision being the repercussions of this? Because media, and especially social media, has come to play a very important role in these types of conflicts. We saw that, in fact, with the color revolutions, in fact, the Orange Revolution, that was largely carried out, or at least orchestrated and coordinated through social media, right? And now that that's being essentially shut down by and large in Russia, what repercussions can we anticipate, or how would you speak to what's going on there?
I'll let someone else talk since I just talked.
There's no rule. You can talk twice in a row if you want to.
Good, Eric.
All right, well, I'll go then. Fine, you twisted my arm. So in terms of social media and censorship, we have to realize that Russia was not exactly an open society to begin with when it came to media. Prior to this, broadcast media and print media were heavily regulated. Kind of what happened within Russia was the invasion, and the consequences of the invasion finally allowed Russia to do with the few remaining free media institutions in Russia. It finally gave them the justification to do what they always want to do, which was shut them down. And that's exactly what happened. You had Radio Echo, I think, shut down. You had the TV station that did the showed the Swan Lake performance when they went off the air. I can't remember their name, but obviously they were shut down. And so interesting, what you are left with is a heavier reliance on social media. And what's interesting there is that the censorship is kind of going both directions. Yes, the Russians are cracking down on the ability of, social media platforms to operate in Russia, but those platforms are also are disabling functionality within Russia itself. Google has basically said that they're not going to actively support systems in Russia as a way of punishing and pressuring the Russian government. And so I think, this speaks to sort of the essential role that media and social media plays in society, because it's being wielded as a weapon, not just in terms of the messages of the media itself, but in terms of the ability to access it. It is itself its own front, I think, in the war itself, and the ability to control both the messaging and the access are an important part of the larger struggle that's taking place, in Ukraine and Russia right now.
That's a great point. Forbes actually recently posited that the invasion is the first social media war, so to speak, with live streaming and up-to-the-minute coverage through social media platforms, which is really transforming in some ways the nature of the conflict. Is this something that you think we can envision seeing continue moving forward, or what direction do you see that going in?
Well, Ariane, can I get, maybe an alternative point of view on this is, I think the Russian campaign on how they manage information is sloppy due to the lack of intentionality of what happened. I think from a standpoint of this campaign is they didn't think it was going to go down like it went down. So I think there was a lot of lack of preparation for not just the general public, but I've heard from logistics. There's some soldiers that went in and they thought they were just doing some military exercises and ended up in a full-scale war. So I think some of the challenges that they just can't recover from. They can try to shut things down all they want when it comes to social media, but the lack of preparing their public for what actually happened is the real debacle here, and there's nothing they can do to stop that.
I think you're right. I think what we're really, that's why we're seeing in some ways really a crackdown on censorship, an increase of censorship, right? Because there is no more sort of winning the hearts and minds, so to speak, through whatever narrative you want to present. It's, this is the only narrative that will be taught or tolerated. And we're seeing that now in schools as well, where school children are being made without any even real explanation as to why they're being asked to do this, to sing patriotic songs and to line up in the shape of a Z and look all happy for whatever camera is taking pictures of them, right? And parents have been outraged, saying, I had no idea that my kid was going to be asked to do this. I never would have sent him or her to school. But now there's increasingly less choice in that matter. And if they even today extended sort of the boundaries of what constitutes, speaking out against the regime. It's not just the government, but it's really any governmental agency, so to speak, is considered illegal and comes with a potential 15-year fine, right? So it's now become a matter of really cracking down on free speech, what was left of it. And I think, as Eric correctly pointed out, there wasn't much to begin with, really starting with when Putin came into power in the late 90s, early 2000, late 1999. There really was sort of this assertion of power and centralization of power. So definitely an interesting trend that we're seeing, kind of back to a more Soviet approach to propaganda and censorship.
Yeah, and in many ways, Russia has taken a page out of the CCP's playbook, right? One totalitarian state learning from another. I think the difference is that in Russia, they've had a window open, or cracked open at that, for the last 20 or 30 years, maybe 40 years, if we go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, where information was getting in. There is a pattern of using Western technologies. Instagram is very popular in Russia, for example, Facebook less so. Twitter is also prevalent in the country, whereas these services are by and large totally blocked off in China, right? The Chinese population are utterly programmed to the messaging that comes out of the state and believe every word, or the vast majority of them believe what they're told. And I think the danger is that Russia could go the same way. I've read articles where mothers and daughters have been talking via video chat from Ukraine to Russia, and the mother in Russia just doesn't believe what the daughter is telling her about buildings being blown up behind her, because the state media says a contrary message. So plainly the state is programming its population in order to remove all semblance of resistance for or doubts in the totality of the legitimacy that Putin is exercising here.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't remember which media agency it was, but when they did finally go off the air, one of the reporters made a comment that Russia was becoming North Korea. But that was exactly, that's where they were headed, right? So, yeah. I want to take a look at the chat and make sure we're not missing anything here. Teresa was asking whether Russian citizens who are against the war might be given asylum in other countries to escape Putin's regime. I know that a lot of intellectuals have fled. A lot of reporters have hightailed it out of Russia. And in fact, this is not new either. Some of the really more outspoken reporters were already reporting from Western Europe or the US. So certainly there is a bit of an exodus already happening. Whether they'll be given asylum, I don't know. I don't know if any of you could speak to that. What is the panel's point of view on non-aligned West soft power for Russia, given their collective economic power? What will be the West or US policy to address it? This sounds like an Eric question.
Yeah, well, on that question, the non-aligned countries are more or less, condemning what's happening here. I think India, in the Security Council, India did abstain from a resolution that condemned Russia, but China abstained as well. They did not attempt to veto it. So that suggests that while some countries are hedging their bets and trying not to be overtly supportive of Ukraine, generally speaking, the international consensus is this is a violation of sovereignty, and this is wrong, and it needs to be condemned. And in some cases, the Ukrainian resistance needs to be actively supported. And, for me, what the most interesting country in this context is China, which you could argue is not necessarily a non-aligned country. It is historically, at least recent history, has been allied with Russia. And it's taken a very quiet approach to this, and has not been all that forthcoming with both verbal expressions of support as well as material expressions of support. I saw somewhere that a lot of the Russian equipment relies on Chinese tires to function. And obviously, we all see the equipment's not working as properly as it should, or is just being destroyed. And so a lot of those spare parts are not coming as quickly from places like China as perhaps the Russians hoped, or perhaps didn't hope because they thought this would be over by now. So I think in terms of, the countries that don't see themselves as having a dog in the fight, they tend to be supportive of the idea that what Russia did is wrong and have condemned it.
Well, I think given what's going on right now, I think every country has to condemn what's happening, but there's this concept of sphere of influence that leads that every country has a dog in a fight one way or the other, right? And, they may not want to say they're against what Russia's doing, but, their sphere of influence leads them to not say that they're against it, right? Or, a country may feel obligated to be on the side of NATO or Europe for some other sphere of influence. So I think that's where it really gets challenging, because, there's so much interdependency beyond the supply chain from one country to another. So I think there's a lot of countries that would just hope it would end, like all of us.
Yeah, it comes down to markets and money, right? All of this comes down to money, right? China's not going to side with the West because it doesn't want to have its entire markets embargoed, right? And plainly, that would cause all kinds of global supply chain issues if we cut trade with China overnight, right, without building up alternative supply routes. I think India's sitting on the fence because it gets most of its defense materials from Russia, and there's a long history of trade between Russia and India from a military standpoint. I agree with you, though, that the rest of the world is pretty much aligned against Russia at this point, but there's a certain degree of pragmatism that's being exercised here. One other point I wanted to make on Eric, when you talked about the military supply lines, I think one of the things to bear in mind is that most of the weaponry that Russia is using in this war is actually of the Soviet era, and a lot of that weaponry was actually manufactured in Poland and Ukraine and Belarus, where the Soviet Union had a lot of its weapons manufacturing capabilities. Kazakhstan, for example, right? And plainly, those manufacturing plants no longer exist. They've been shuttered a long time ago. So Russia's ability to replenish its military arsenal as it continues to expend it is limited, right? The West has ramped up, one would presume, ramped up its military industrial machinery and is producing bullets and bombs and missiles as quickly as it possibly can right now, in expectation that there's a market there for those weapons. Russia's not able to do that. The longer this war goes on, the weaker Russia becomes economically, militarily, politically, and obviously opposing that is the impact to the Ukrainian people, who are basically being hounded into the ground, as we're seeing.
I just read an article, actually, to your point, that the only factory that's producing tanks in Russia had to shut down because they couldn't get parts.
Right, yeah. It's the parts, it's the components, it's Russia's own supply chains and its manufacturing capabilities here. So at some point, they're going to run out of bullets and bombs, right?
Right.
The question is what residual damage is left as a result of that, and to what extent Putin reverts to other, more more nefarious weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, nuclear, because plainly he's a cornered rat right now, and can't be seen to be backing down because he's made a major miscalculation. And if he backs down, he's dead. If he goes forward, he's dead. So, it's a very precarious situation he's in.
Yeah, it's a staggering miscalculation from a supply planning standpoint. And like if you look at some of the U.S. history the U.S. military campaigns of just amazing military intelligence, planning, logistics, getting everything ready to go. That's never been the Soviet Union or Russia's strength. And all these signs just lead to Putin thinking he was going to walk in a week. The president of Ukraine was going to flee, and he would reinstall his puppet government, and not many people would get hurt. The Russian public would never find out about it. So it was just an unbelievable miscalculation, because even when you talk about like tanks and a lot of these munitions, they have elements of a global supply chain. And to Richard's point, a lot of the Russian material is, from old Soviet era, is no longer a part of a modern conventional supply chain system. How could his logisticians miscalculated and not giving him the right advice on that? It's just staggering that this whole thing came about.
I don't think Putin's actually being open to receiving advice for a couple of years. He's been increasingly isolated for the last 2 years through COVID. And we've seen that in his TV appearances. He's at the other end of a very long table, and he has assumed the role of czar in all of his TV appearances, with gilded doors being opened for him and everything else. Right? He's really put himself out there and above levels of advice, and has surrounded himself with yes men and yes women. Right? Had he listened, had he sought the advice of others, he might not be in this situation. So this is typical of a lot of autocrats, unfortunately, if we look back through history.
Yeah, one of the scary things too is that when Putin first came to power, he was really seen as this new, strong, capable figure that was going to bring Russia back to its grandeur, right? And a lot of people bought into that. He was very popular. Over the years, there were some questionable political sort of stunts that made people think, really, what's this guy really about? We've all seen these pictures of him, fly fishing bare-chested with the Ray-Bans or whatever, and being this sort of macho man in Russia. And early on, it was like, yeah, we have this strong leader who is going to rebuild Russia. But then as time went on, that started to crumble. And I think that as it began to crumble, he replaced sort of these images with force, in a sense, that it was, okay, if you're not going to buy into it willingly, then we're going to start cracking down on the media. Then we're going to start, ostracizing advisors. We're going to start doing all these things that have led us to where we are now. So it's been interesting to watch the transformation. This isn't surprising in many ways, but it is definitely unfortunate that it's come to this, and that he has made miscalculations that are now really having global repercussions. So really good points, everyone. I know we're kind of coming close to the 7 o'clock mark, and I'm wondering if we can kind of open this up to more of a big picture sort of discussion as to where we started. What might trigger a broader global conflict? What might be the tipping point where NATO or the US and NATO assume more involvement in this conflict? What are everyone's thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, I'm convinced it's a 130-mile patch of land between where the supply lines are coming in from Poland and Belarus. And if Belarus all of a sudden joins the war, which, by the way, the other thing I'm not sure if everybody's heard of, but Russian supplies were coming through the rail line through Belarus, and it was sabotage, which prevented a lot of Russian material from coming in. So I think there's definitely a dissident group in Belarus that's against this. But nonetheless, if soldiers cross the line and try to take over that supply route, which a ton of supplies is coming through, and there's a hot war between Belarus and Poland, then that would, by what's it called, Rule 5, would bring NATO into the battle.
Collective defense agreement. Plainly any attack against a NATO member would result in some level of response from Russia. I think also if Russia were to start, gassing the Ukrainian people in the cities, that would probably involve some level of escalated response other than economic sanctions. Plainly, the West is playing the long game here. It's playing we're the mature party to this conflict, and we're going to wait for our economic sanctions to bite, and for either for the oligarchs to step up and remove Putin, or for the people to step up and remove Putin, which is the ultimate goal. Because I think the probability of Putin backing off and the agreement of a negotiated settlement that is acceptable to both Ukraine and Putin is highly unlikely.
Yeah, I think NATO is the tripwire right now. Any attack on a NATO country invokes Article 5, and that would lead us to a very dark place, I think, because then you create the ladder of escalation that could involve nuclear weapons. And I don't think Russia, even with a slightly deranged Putin in charge, is going to risk that. I could be wrong. Also, I think the point someone else made about humanitarian atrocities, there's a possibility of an old CNN effect kicking in here. And if we do see, gas attacks or, mass atrocities on television screens, on social media posts or whatever, that might create a groundswell for some kind of intervention based on humanitarian terms. That's a less likely scenario than Article 5 tripwire. But, in places like Somalia, we've seen that happen in the past. So I wouldn't rule it out necessarily.
Just looking at the chat here to see if we're missing anything. Ellen asked a long time ago in the chat what everyone is kind of reading, where everyone is getting their information. There's a lot of reliable stuff out there and much that isn't so reliable. So what are some sources that we should be turning to kind of keep an eye on what's happening in a reliable sense? And I can also open it up to the audience, if you'd like to share, just maybe turn on your cameras and share any thoughts or questions in that regard.
Don't watch cable news.
Yeah. I mean, Ariana, one thing I was going to say with something you said earlier is, one person who's been pretty consistent about his view about Vladimir Putin has been Garry Kasparov, the Grand Chess Master. I mean, if you can hear anything what he has to say about this conflict, listen to what he has to say. He's got some very insightful thoughts.
Yeah, he has a very good Twitter account, so that's a good place to check him out.
I would agree with Richard. Go to the BBC.
Yeah,
BBC.
and I would also say, those former generals that are commenting. I mean, I follow a lot of what Petraeus has been saying over the last weeks, and he's a man who knows the scene, even if he's not read into what's going on right now. And there are others out there, admirals, generals, and former NATO folks that can speak off the record and can share their experiences here. One thing to bear in mind is a lot of the information we're getting in the West is coming out of Ukraine. There is a possibility that there is some level of propaganda around that and some semi-truths. So just consider what you read, consider the sources of what you read, and try and balance it with a collection of different sources. I read an immense amount of stuff every day on what's happening there, particularly around the cyberspace. To try and judge what could potentially happen tomorrow. It's difficult, but I think if you just go to one or two sources, you're only going to see best part of the picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing in the chat here the BBC, Jerusalem Post, Deutsche Welle,
France 24.
I would add actually the Moscow Times, which is no longer operating out of Moscow, but they are, kind of, they're speaking into the issue. It's an English newspaper, Australian news. So basically a lot of global sources, I think is what we're looking at, not just American or Western points of view necessarily.
And I would also add, kind of cultivate a basket of Twitter accounts and social media accounts to kind of follow along with on different topics. Because I follow accounts, for example, that literally track every loss of Russian equipment. And that can be a very insightful narrative in terms of the status of the war, and so if you kind of cultivate a garden, if you will, of social media, that can be a very good way of finding that balance.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Anything that anyone would like to raise that we haven't covered yet? Obviously, we had kind of a narrowly focused, or we tried to keep it somewhat narrowly focused tonight because there's so much we could potentially discuss. But if there are other questions that you'd like to raise for the panelists, I'm sure they would entertain those. I see some things still popping up into the chat. Carly has a hand raised. Would you like to go ahead and speak up, Carly?
Yes, I have several friends who are from the Ukraine that are here now in the States and Canada, and they're getting a lot of information feed from their families through WhatsApp and such. So they let us know on Facebook and different things what's going on. The toll, the psychological toll is overwhelming. And I'm wondering about, so far they tell me there's between 3.8 to 4 million Ukrainians that have left. And the impact to that on Poland, Romania, Moldova, the various countries in Europe, in absorbing the swell of those immigrants and support and psychologically the conflict resolves itself, hopefully, in a better way than what I'm seeing. But what do you feel would be the future for that area? Because it looks like Estonia, Latvia, and those countries in that Eastern Front area coming through, they've suffered a lot under Russian authorities. So I'm just kind of seeing what you feel might maybe come out of that. I don't know if I'm making sense or not in that regard.
Yeah, I think there's 2 points there. One is, obviously there's a humanitarian and resettlement cost there. And fortunately, we have the assets of quite a lot of Russian billionaires that have been confiscated that can be, once they clear the courts, that can be used in order to assist those refugees. And I think the second part of your question is, the Russian bordering states. I foresee that we will have a much greater NATO presence in those countries moving forwards. But I'll leave it to Eric. Eric's really the SME in this area.
No, you hit it right on. Like I said before, NATO is being revitalized by the conflict and dealing with the new security threat that Russia now poses to the now expanded NATO. And that's a separate discussion whether the expansion of NATO has its own contribution to this conflict. Is going to be increasingly important, and you're going to see a pouring of resources into those Eastern European countries, especially those that Russia has sort of directly threatened, like Poland, like the Baltic republics, for the foreseeable future, assuming that Putin's not going away anytime soon.
Just one other really quick question on that. So you've got the stans, as I call them, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, those kind of areas, which are rich in minerals that flow into Russia. Then you've got the West Coast side and the China and US in that area. And you've got Finland and Sweden in that area where they do a lot of shipping out of. Do you feel that would be, we have anything to worry about in those areas as well, because as a result of this conflict?
Yeah.
That's my last question. Thank you.
One thing I wanted to say before I answer Carly's question, and it kind of ties to Ellen's question, and it ties to what Eric and Richard just said, is one other thing you should read is the past. We talked about current news sources, but if you look at the past of Ukraine, Russia, even read Pushkin. There's a lot of devastating history of this region, and you can see why Russia feels cornered by NATO being in on its borders, and you know why Ukraine feels the way it did, given what happened in World War II and all these just really devastating situations. So just wanted to add to that, but to answer Carly's question, really relating to what's, the potential of any sort of problems on the Baltic Sea, there's tremendous potential there. Basically, what you're talking about is that whole region is very significant when it comes to minerals around the world. We already mentioned some of them, but there's a whole list of them, what's going on there. And I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibilities for Putin to escalate it in that direction as well, because these are non-NATO countries, which is maybe the reason why they're moving in that direction. So you can see how many different degrees of freedom where this could head pretty bad.
I think you raise a good point there, Jack. The history of Russia under the Tsars and also under Stalin, right? That was pretty draconian, and it resulted in the murders of millions and millions of Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, right? And their replacement by Russian diaspora, right? Russia pushed Russian peoples out into these lands in order to control these people. So we end up with, look at Moldova, right? There's a massive Russian population in Moldova. You've got Russian populations that took over Crimea, essentially, right, from the Turkic people that were there before, right, and obviously Donbass and Luhansk areas, right. You've got Russians that are Russian populations that have been resettled into large parts of Estonia, right, and so Putin could play this same game again in order to protect Russian emigres that moved to these countries under Stalin.
Yeah, I saw someone in the chat talk about a possible solution, turning Ukraine into like a Finland. The problem right now is that Finland doesn't want to be Finlandized anymore. It wants to align with NATO now. And I don't think Ukraine would be interested in that outcome, because obviously they are realizing in a very visceral way that that's not really an option for them. So the idea that you could somehow turn them into a neutral party that would take no sides, that might have been something you could do, 5 years ago or even 1 year ago, but that ship might have sailed now. And I don't think those who are fighting in Ukraine right now see themselves fighting to become a 100% neutral party that can't align itself one way or the other.
Yeah. And there's another lesson there from history, right? If we look at the Finland-Russia conflict back in the 20th century, Russia got, massacred by the Finns when they tried to take over Finland. And I think there's, the same thing is happening in Ukraine right now. And, Russia doesn't appear to have learned the lessons from the past. But yeah, I think that the solution is complex right now, and I think it's going to take a while before we get to the position where Russia is really willing to come to the negotiating table or to back its troops out of Ukraine. So unfortunately, that doesn't end very well for the Ukrainian cities and for the Ukrainian people. So the alternative, of course, is an escalation of the conflict to use weapons of mass destruction, which I think we're all trying to avoid right now.
Ola has her hand raised, and actually she raised a question in the chat a while ago. What to do when 70% of Russians in Russia support Putin? What can make a difference? And I think it's a good question. I'm wondering if maybe you'd like to elaborate on that a little bit. Or did she leave?
Oh no, I'm here.
Oh, there you are. You moved on my screen. I'm sorry. I thought maybe you left.
Thank you so much for letting me speak. I'm Ukrainian American, with majority of my family in Western Ukraine, which is considered a safe place relatively, flooded with refugees. And unfortunately, I guess there was a topic raised what to do with Putin and his administration. And there was, I guess, a few scenarios of elite stepping up and replacing him, or people with currently 70% of people, and I believe it's both Russian and some other international sources did a survey supporting Putin blindly, what's the likelihood of actually people, I mean, the likelihood of people overthrowing him is extremely less. And I guess what I would say Western parties, or what can be done to change people's perspective just a little bit?
You know, if you
I'll
wouldn't
say,
mind me kind of jumping in just a little bit, I did research on this years ago when Putin was first coming into power. And like I said, a little while back in the presentation, he was initially very popular because he was coming in at a time when, you know, the Soviet experience had been a very difficult one, and people were doing very poorly. They were standing in bread lines and life was not good. Their experience with democracy had not been a good one. And he was really seen as this strong figure, again, who was capable of bringing Russia back to a greater sort of era. It's hard to tell now really what level of support exists. I think that, you know, well, the polling agency that was somewhat reputable 10, 12 years ago is no longer so reputable. It's more of a state-owned, state-run agency at this point. And we saw also this rally that he held recently, where, you know, there were just throngs of people cheering him on, and later, you know, learned that people had been paid to show up and had been bussed in, had been given time off work and all these incentives to come show up and cheer on Putin. And so it's hard to really know what that level of support is. Certainly that's how elections work as well, right? We hear about the carousels, bus carousels that basically shuttle people from one polling station to the next and have them vote over and over again. I think there's a high level of apathy in Russia, in the sense that people have given up on being able to do much about it. They know that the elections are rigged. They know that Putin has changed the term limits over and over again to keep himself in power, you know, until the end of time. And so there is this question about, well, you know, okay, life is better, generally speaking, better than it was in the 90s. We have more opportunities than we did then. Not now, of course, that's changed dramatically. And so whether the sanctions will have an effect is a good question. But there's really, I think, a very real question of what can people actually do? Because at this point in time, we're seeing people getting arrested, you know, in large numbers for speaking out against Putin and the regime. So maybe, in my opinion, like any other revolution, color revolution, what needs to change is the loyalty of the military establishment and the police. That's what we saw in Georgia, I believe it was, where the military were tying little roses on the ends of their rifles and saying, we're done, right? But as far as everyday citizens go, it's hard for me to envision an option that really exists for everyday people to be able to speak up and really make a difference. And Aaron looks like he's dying to chime in, so go for it.
Yeah, so I had a question, and I figured I might as well throw a former graduate into that mix. Is that it seems like our approach is basically compellence from like an IR perspective, but typically through compellence you have reassurance if there's a deal through compellence, right? And if our deal is, well, then we shift to regime change, then there's not really a lot of incentives or motivation for responding to that compellence from the Russian side. So then we're sort of in this vicious cycle of sort of hoping that something nice happens, you know, meaning, you know, the Russian people rise up or blah, 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 you know, and assuming 50-50 that doesn't happen, we're sort of left back to the starting gate again of just sort of compellence. So if our goal is a deal, are we preparing ourselves in the West? Because we all know that deals don't look nice, right? They involve compromises. And are we preparing ourselves for what that sort of those expectations would be? So that's sort of my big question. And then a small one, which is about a former graduate, is given that both Prime Minister Merkel, you know, is, I think, a very credible, you know, ex-EU leader or leader within the EU and could represent EU interests. And someone like Condi Rice, former Secretary of State, could, you know, larger than sort of political party affiliation, be able to sort of operate with someone like Prime Minister Merkel, and they're both fluent Russian speakers, to create sort of a shuttle diplomacy model between obviously the US and Russia, which is what Russia wants to negotiate. And Merkel brings the EU to the table, given that she's had hundreds of conversations with Putin in the last 15 plus years. Do you think that something like that could get constructed? And if we don't, we're just going to go down this sort of continuous escalation cycle and sort of double down on compellence. And then it's just a question of, okay, if that doesn't work after 3 or 6 months, then what? So I have kind of two questions. One on, do we have some plan beyond compellence, and are we getting ready ourselves for what that might be? And do you see any type of leaders that could step in and start that shuttle diplomacy?
I would say that Macron right now kind of is, at least initially, was fulfilling that role, because Putin was actually calling Macron up to talk to him and say, listen, I want you guys to know what I'm doing here, or at least I need to tell you what's going on here. It was like when Trump called Fox and Friends, when he was a president, right? He'd call in and sort of tell the host what was going on. And I know it's a bit of a crude metaphor, but that's kind of what was going on initially with Macron. I'm not sure if he's still calling up Macron or not. You could theoretically, try to engage in shuttle diplomacy of some kind, but shuttle diplomacy requires, a credible mediator. And I don't know if the Russians see the United States or Germany at this point as a credible mediator, or as, members of that foreign policy establishment, even former members, as credible mediators. I think the other thing you raised was about, is the West prepared to accept what an agreement looks like? Well, it's not up to the West, it's up to the Ukrainians. They're the other party in this. And if they decide to end the conflict, making certain concessions that the West would prefer not to see, that's not really for us to judge, I think.
Yeah, there was a good article in Foreign Affairs yesterday, I believe it was, that was talking about a negotiated settlement on what Ukraine would likely accept. Right, plainly they would poll their citizens in respective regions as to any outcome to make sure it was democratically supported by the Ukrainian people. And the article suggested that it was more than likely that the population of Crimea would probably vote to remain part of Russia, whereas the populations of Luhansk and Donetsk would more than likely vote to remain part of a Ukrainian settlement. And that, of course, is on the premise that Russian forces withdraw from everything that they've captured since February.
My experience with Russians, both there and here, even dabbling their language a little bit, is not a lot of optimism here. Just historically looking at the way governments have responded, does Putin really care about people? There was a little bit of a sunrise with what happened in the early 90s, but then the oligarchs took everything over, right? So even when there was supposed to be a democratic revolution, the people got screwed. So, just conversations I have with people, are they willing, how many people are willing to take to the streets when they think what's around the corner is not going to be that much better? And that's really sad. And it's hard for us as Americans to appreciate and understand that. But, that just seems what I get from the culture and the people. Not a lot of optimism for what's next.
Yeah, I think that's really spot on, and a wonderfully pessimistic way to conclude potentially our webinar this evening. Really a lot of fantastic questions and a great discussion tonight. Unless anyone has any other burning questions that they'd like to raise here, I think that we could call it a night and thank our panelists. And just, I think wait and see kind of how everything turns out. You shed a lot of really interesting and helpful light on this whole situation. So
can I try to end it on a positive note?
Please, we'll let you redo it. Do it again, Jack.
I think I think what happened in Ukraine, and I think Eric could probably correct me on this one, but I think there was a lot of optimism over the leadership in Ukraine. And I think the Russians are afraid of that. And I think if anything positive could come out of that, it could be that. I think it could show people in Eastern Europe that there is a way to fight corruption and to support the people and to be a person of the people. So.
No, I think in Ukrainians, I think that was one of their reasons for, I mean, among the obvious reasons for resistance was that, you know, we got rid of our corrupt leader back in 2014, and we expected you, Russia, to do the same thing, and you didn't. And now we're paying the price for it.
I think there's a very there's a very real possibility that, you know, the longer this war goes on, the more sense of the greater the sense of awareness will become across the people of the former, you know, Soviet Union, and I think we could see uprisings in other Soviet states as well against their autocratic leaders. Plainly, Alexander Lukashenko is very unpopular in Belarus, right? The leaders of a lot of the southern states of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan are equally unpopular. And I think that's one of the reasons why Putin took the action he did, because he realized that, you know, this democratization of former Soviet states was endangering his long-term legitimacy. So let's watch and see what happens, I guess.
Again, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you to all the attendees. I wanted to just mention I will be sending out a recording of this most likely tomorrow. So if you did miss any piece of this dynamic discussion, you can have the recording. Again, thank you. And if you have any questions about our programs or anything following up, please go ahead and send a message in the chat and I'll stick around for that. Thanks again, everyone.